Welcome. Tonight, I have gathered my Roman Wizard hat, a meth lab in the abandoned Borders bookstore, and a whole lot of blood, so I could bring you an overview of the book Blood Sigils for Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. First things first, formally, fuck the Tremere. I don't like him. I'm considered sort of the Triple Crown heavyweight, 5-time ring holder, #1 Tremere hater, voted 20 years in a row. Not my thing. And because of these deeply held beliefs, this book wasn't really on my radar. But I'm going to let you know up front, I like this book kind of a lot. And I didn't think it would be my thing, but I'm here to talk about it. Because I'm not one of those weirdos who waste their time making videos about things I hate, especially in the TTRPG space, but that's just me. So in this video, I'm going to kind of go over the purpose of the book. We're going to do a chapter by chapter kind of quick look at what the book has to actually offer. I'll mention some personal highlights of mine and sort of talk about my overall opinion at the end. So yeah, let's just get into it. So first things first, what is this book? This book is a source book for what's now referred to as the scene, or the bloodcraft scene. Basically, this refers to the state of blood magic in the 5th edition vampire lore. Instead of a bunch of separate schools of magic with all their different terms and connected to different clans and things like that, this scene, blood magic, is pretty much just one big messy domain now. Those who do blood magic are called red workers. The scene and red workers, these are sort of new terms to refer to all of this, and it's weird, it's a little out there, it's overly dramatic, and that's why I kind of dig it. It feels vampire. It feels much more vampire than a lot of the schools of magic and things like that from the past. So I'm going to use these terms because the book uses these terms, and we'll go from there. So the book explains a lot of the lore surrounding this state of blood magic, this scene. It has a lot of content that's really useful for both players who want to more immerse themselves and build characters that really fit in with this lore, and a ton of content for storytellers as well, to not only put this in your chronicle, to build entire chronicles just focus on this. There's that much information in here where you can easily do that. And yes, it does give us plenty of new blood magic rituals, as well as thin blood alchemy, which, of course, something we always want more of, and it's got quite a bit of it, which is awesome, as well as it has rules for actually creating your own, which we'll get into. They have things like artifacts, grimoires, a lot of NPCs and factions, some new mechanics involving things like places of power, stuff like that as well. There's lots of lore, lots of new ideas in here, and even a ready-made chronicle. So if a storyteller wants to, they could pick this up and sort of jump right in to get a feel for what blood magic's going to be like. So let's break this down. I'm just going to kind of go through chapter by chapter and give an idea of what's actually in the book. Start with an introduction to the scene. As I said before, the scene refers to the state of blood magic in this edition. This chapter does a really good job of sort of setting the tone and building the lore off of that, so you get an idea of some of the changes. It helps fill in a lot of the gaps that have happened, specifically, especially with the Tremere and the Bond of Akeem from previous editions. So this lays out a world where the old libraries have been blown up, in many cases quite literally, so their secrets are just scattered now, which means there's all of this knowledge and all these rituals that are ripe for the plunder for any enterprising upstarts or old entities looking to reestablish their hordes. Then, of course, there's thin blood alchemy, which is a new take on blood magic, but still falls within that category. This operates more like an underground, like the drug trade scene, except for kindred, which is interesting because now even true vampires can actually take some of these alchemical brews. I like this because blood magic feels dangerous, both for those using it and those who are a victim of it. It's dangerous not just because of like the nature of using magic and its consequences, but there's a lot of political implications to that now. And you're dealing with a setting where you're throwing in like sorcerers and like old like shaman types with essentially drug dealers, and throwing them all into one world that's very much in flux and up for grabs. So it's just this powder keg of just weird, messy magic. And it also paints red workers, or people who use blood magic, as sort of like these addicts. There's addicts for power or pleasure, and rather than I do blood magic because I'm a stuffy academic or a prayer warrior, there's people who have this blood in them, these vampires who already could potentially live forever and do all these amazing things, and still thought, actually, I'm going to need a little bit more out of my blood, and I'm going to mess around, fuck around, find out, and maybe do some awesome stuff, or maybe die trying. It's no longer just purely political machinations, but this weird drive and addiction and just need for more, which it's a formula for a great time, I think. Then we have the players chapter. This starts with the people. This section has a lot of essentially character archetypes, NPCs. Like the clans have different archetypes that you kind of can find inspiration from, or some common ideas about what's associated with those clans. This is quite a few list of the similar archetypes, but of people that can be found working in this scene. Not necessarily just all people who do blood magic, but also the people involved in it and kind of get caught up in all of that. This is a really good chapter if you're making a coterie and you all want to kind of focus on this scene. You can get an idea of which roles you could potentially fill. And then, of course, this is, even though it's in the players chapter, it's a very useful section for storytellers who also want inspiration ideas of how to populate their chronicle if they're going to focus on this as well. Then there's the places. This section lists places that are sort of also relevant to the scene, as far as like different occult sites and just different ideas of places that are going to be useful for finding or dealing in red work. This also introduces what's called a furcus, which is an area where you can sort of tap into magic. These are magical ley lines or veins, to be more thematically appropriate, that run through the earth. And there's some new rituals and things like that that interact with them in interesting ways to give you special advantages or help out with rituals. There's a section called Bloody Business. This gets into rules and mechanics and suggestions on how to handle the component gathering. Both blood magic rituals and thin blood alchemy require stuff or require materials components. And if you have a whole game focused on this, obviously you don't want this to turn into like a weird magic just shopping episode slog. So it has some interesting suggestions I think will be useful for storytellers to keep in mind, as far as how long it should take to get certain components based on obviously how rare they are and how powerful the magic is they'll be fueling, and also just if there's going to be interesting consequences to getting them. So it's not just really strict item gathering all the time. A section called Kettle Battle. The book describes this as a mix between a cooking competition and a hip-hop cipher. This is basically where thin bloods gather to show off, talk trash, and then see who has the best brews. And there's like prizes and things like that, as far as like gaining status or other resources. It's all pretty ridiculous, and I mean that as a compliment. Then there's the making the scene section. This was really interesting. I don't think I remember seeing in other books, and it's something I think they should incorporate in all future source books. It gives really good advice for storytellers specifically, though again, this is in the player section, but we'll ignore that, on how to build a chronicle, specifically a blood magic chronicle. They give you sort of step-by-step instructions and suggestions on how to build your story, introduce interesting narratives, and then how to track those narratives. In this, they call it trends and heat. So they're the trends or the different sort of story beats, and then you track how much heat and sort of relevance and escalation these different narratives have. It's cool. I like that it's added ideas that's specific to this book and this sort of tone, and I think is just really useful, especially for new storytellers trying to figure out where do I even begin with all of this. Next, we have the magics chapter. Speaking of addicts, this is what we all really wanted, right? If those sweet powers. If you don't really care about anything else and you're just looking for more magic for freaky little wizard, you're in luck, actually. If I counted correctly, there are 25 rituals and 20 alchemy formulae. And yes, this includes Chaldunic sorcery, which I'm very happy about. And while you will see some of the old powers receive updates in this section, there's quite a few new ones as well. And I think that's a good thing, because a lot of the old powers, as I said, they're out of place. We don't need them, and a lot didn't make the cut, which I'm happy about. A lot of the new ones, pretty cool, pretty flavorful. In fact, most of these rituals have some sort of flavor text that connects them to a certain either sort of paradigm or clan or something like that. So that's still there for people who think this clan should be doing this type of magic. You could still sort of follow that, and it gives you suggestions on that. But also, like I said, it's all up for grabs if you're able to find it. One of my absolutely favorite things they've done with the rituals is that they've added consequences. Now, not all of them, but quite a few of them have, where not only here's what happens if you succeed, it's here's what happens if you fail. A lot have some interesting consequences that happen. Some also require you to cause aggravated damage to yourself to cast them. I love this. This makes magic actually a dangerous thing and a much more interesting thing. I'm not going to list all of the new powers in the book, but I am going to pick out a few that I think are interesting and worth sharing. First, I gotta mention Chaldunic sorcery. This is a type of magic that originally belonged to the Tzimisce, and it involves magically manipulating the earth and the elements. In this book, there's a level 1 ritual you take that's sort of a prerequisite to the rest of it, but it's pretty cool. It involves you cut your arm, stick it in the ground, and you literally make some sort of like blood bond with the earth, and you select your element, and you can potentially do this multiple times if you want to get all the elements and be the vampire avatar or whatever. But it's cool. It lets you do all sorts of things where you can sense in a very, very wide radius. And then while you're sensing out over your stretch of land, you can just summon different elemental forces to just wreck people. And it's awesome. There's a ritual called Craftmaster, which I thought was really cool, to where essentially you take someone's blood and you brew your thing, and you use that to temporarily gain dots or specialties and whatever skills they had. There's a ritual called Depths of Nightmare, which you essentially target someone, you give them nightmares, and they take willpower damage, and this can happen over multiple days. And while in their just week of nightmare hell, they also can't actually heal that willpower during this time while the ritual's taking effect, which is terrifying thought as well. And I'm so excited to use this against people. There's Viscera Garden, which you can create plants, bloodthirsty plants, and the vampires can actually eat these plants to feed and reduce their hunger. You can also feed these plants to other people, and after they fed on them, it makes it easier for you to do certain rituals to them, so you can sabotage someone by giving them a salad. And also, you have to keep these plants fed, which is kind of a fun little roleplay thing. Of course, you can use your own blood or the corpses of your enemies, whatever you're feeling. There's Seeking Tiamat and Tiamat Glistens, which are dramatic and metal and cool names for essentially finding these weird veins of magic or blood magic in the earth that you can tap for all sorts of things. There's Soul of the Homunculus, and that is different than a homunculus because with this ritual, you use a pig to create a smaller, fucked up little version of yourself with some of your own skills and stuff like that. The implications are terrifying, and I'm so excited. There's Stone of the True Form, which is you make a rock and you hit things with that rock and it dispels anything that's not real. You can throw it at illusions and stuff, it'll dispel them. Also, anything that has been changed by a discipline is also reverted back. So Gangrel get an attitude, they pop their claws, throw a rock at them, claws are back. This also works on werewolves. If you need to throw a rock at a werewolf and they will pop back in their original form real quick, which is wild. This one's so cool, and I like how it's just a very powerful weaponized marble. There's also Plague Oracle rituals, which is where a kindred makes themselves sick, and then they can either tap into like the collective knowledge or senses of everyone with that disease in a 12-mile radius, which I looked it up, and that is, for example, most of New York City. This is weird and wild and cool, and I'm excited to see this in action as well. There's also chained rituals, which are something you can do to a level 5 ritual to where you cast 2 other rituals leading into it, chain them together, so your level 5 ritual now has some extra just godlike effect to it, because we need these to be stronger and more dangerous. Then, of course, we have some new Thin Blood Alchemy. If you're someone who doesn't really care for Thin Bloods, you're like, I'm never going to play with those. I don't need to worry about this. You need to be paying attention now, because true vampires can now use Thin Blood Alchemy. Not create it, but they can consume it and get the effects from it, which changes a lot of things, which I think in a very, very interesting way. What's really cool is they call the Wheel of Misfortune, which is a table you roll on, where no matter what, if a vampire imbibes or takes in any way a Thin Blood formula, they have a consequence. This consequence can range, and it happens after the effect happens. So, but they can range from the vampire might puke and they get a little hungry because of it, or they might lose access to all of their disciplines until the next session. And also during this time, they take damage like a Thin Blood. To roll the dice, which again, you want to hoard a bunch of little potions and have all sorts of cool stuff on top of the already cool stuff your vampire could do, more power to you. But one hits your tummy wrong, it's over, and that's fun. Some examples that I think are interesting are as follows. It's body paint, which means vampires can get tattoos now. I feel like they just did this to appease those people that are worried about like the aesthetics and whatnot, and you should be appeasing them. That's your most powerful demographic for this game. There's a formula called Elevate, which gives you a little dex boost, but mostly is used in conjunction with other drugs, and it's basically just means vampires could do drugs now. Instead of having to drink from someone on a drug, you could just do it yourself. So basically, right off the gate, they're like, hey, vampires, you get tattoos, you could do drugs. We're going to make you so cool. This next one, I need to mention because while I like the idea, this is potentially going to ruin some games. It's called Blacklight Surprise. And it's actually even worse than what it sounds. It's a thing that you can smear on a UV light source, like a flashlight, and it makes that light source deal aggravated damage to vampires, which means a handful of Thin Bloods with flashlights can just start roasting people. Obviously, something this powerful is a level 2 formula, and it can last for hours. This is going to be interesting, and I feel bad for certain people who are going to have to deal with this, but also keep those kindred on their toes, right? There's Fire Skin, which not only makes you immune to damage, it sets your skin on fire, which means if you grab or hit someone and you're on fire, you're hurting them with fire. Again, think of the implications. Thin Bloods are getting wild out here. This hospital change. This is something you splash on someone and they can't heal for days potentially. Again, watch your backs. The Thin Bloods are not messing around anymore. Speaking of not messing around, there's a formula called half-living conductor, which is where you become immune to electricity, and when you're electrocuted, you can then shoot electricity. Which means, like, if you're about to fight someone and you see them pull out a fork and dive for the nearest outlet, you better run, because that person is actually a dangerous warrior that's about to fry your ass. There's one that is called Saturn's Flux. This lets you break a blood bond. Huge implications. This is cool, especially like a drug that could break a blood bond. It's going to be all sorts of political stuff like that in any proper Camarilla city especially. What they did with this is, this isn't a potion you take. This is something that you have to smoke specifically out of a pipe, and then you literally shit out your blood bond. And it hurts and take a little bit of damage. So you can break that bond, but not in a dignified way. They also have laid out mechanics for creating your own rituals or alchemy, which I think is really interesting. I mean, who doesn't want to make up their own powers and spells and stuff? And it kind of fits the lore to where, like, everything's up for grabs again. Information is out there, and people are going to be probably taking some of the established stuff, combining it or deconstructing it, and figuring out new interesting ways to use that magic. This also potentially is a huge headache for storytellers. If you have, like, those players who are really just trying to, like, power game and are going to want to be just inventing their own stuff and seeing what they could get away with all the time. But if you're playing with people like that, you're probably already not having a good time. So just a little bit of another tool for that kind of player's arsenal. Then we have a chapter called The Sources. This is a short little chapter that goes into more detail about the lore, specifically about blood sorcery, thin blood alchemy, and how certain clans actually might interact with it. Like, they have little sections for, like, the Bruja or Malkavians and things, and what a red worker from those clans might look like, or why they would be drawn to learning blood magic. They also have some little sections with some interesting kind of places of importance that can be used in a chronicle. There's the Movers and Shakers chapter. I really like this one. This details a lot of the different factions that you're going to find the red workers in. It's interesting because, of course, you have your complications of Anarch versus Camarilla and SI and things like that. But instead, this sort of allows you to build a chronicle where there's just this myriad of different groups and factions, and some of them even have, like, splinter factions within those factions, all just trying to figure out blood magic, all with different ideas of what blood magic is and how to do it, and different paradigms and different goals. But they all kind of have to exist and compete in the same scene, which is very interesting. And that's, of course, on top of all the usual trials and tribulations of being a kindred. This details some of the lore with House Goretrix and House Karna, as well as the Banu Akim and sort of their split and how they might fit into things with their versions. And then it introduces some completely new factions as well. There's the Almost Assembly, which are these, like, online forum organized Thin Bloods who think Thin Bloods, rather than being like a step back from vampirism, is a step forward towards this sort of perfect neo-human thing they're trying to do, which has the benefits of being a vampire without any of the drawbacks. There's the Louis Domien, which was perfect French for those of Domien, who was this swamp Tzimisce, and his followers, or their followers, like, discovered all this corrupted, polluted earth, and instead of getting bummed about it, got stoked and want to use that and control this polluted earth with their Khaldunic sorcery. They even introduced a new resonance to go with them called Deleteric, which is essentially something that poisoned mortals and people dealing with this sort of different mental issues because of being poisoned feed some of their stuff, which is I love it. And then I mentioned the Plague Oracles earlier. These are come from Alcavians originally, and they find a way to magically infect themselves with the things like the cold or flu, typically common diseases that a lot of people have, and they think that these viruses can communicate with each other. So, and anyone who has it, so they're able to just collect data and information and borrow knowledge and skills using this weird sort of magic that mixes like being a mad scientist doctor with like a big data tech surveillance type of situation. And of course, there were plague masks while they do their thing. There's the Sunburners, which are a Sabbat faction of Thin Bloods, which you think, how does that make sense? And because the Sabbat are the Sabbat, and they brought him in because they think they're heralds of the end times, and they're weirdly proud of that. And they also somehow think they're superior to true kindred because they can be in the sun more. So they show that off. They go in the sun, they get burnt, and they proudly wear their scorched flesh as signs of their devotion and superiority. There was the Met on the Path chapter. This, like one of the earlier sections, contains a great deal of NPCs and stats that go with them, except here these are mostly antagonists, and less for player inspiration, more for the storyteller to use against the players. Some examples are this section of spirits that are like manifestations of like magical ideals, but it comes from the sorcerer's blood, and they could do all sorts of weird stuff. There's Chimera, which are like human hybrid type things. They have gargoyles as antagonists, not as the clan. There's salamanders of the fire elemental variety, sphinxes, and they have thinlings, which of course are these fucked up projections that come out of the mouths of sleeping babies and stick to people's faces and suck the blood out of their face. I think I mentioned before, this book is weird. But again, like a good weird. I've been wanting something like this. I don't necessarily want that, but you know what? I like the spirit. Then there's a implements section, which has magical artifacts and grimoires and tomes, as well as what they're calling mysteries, which are just sort of these different legends and things like that that can be really interesting to put in your chronicle and have the coterie sort of look into and potentially gain something from. There's a Chronicles chapter, and this gives everything a storyteller needs, all sorts of really useful tools, so they can build a chronicle specifically around the scene, the Bloodwork scene. There's some example tenets that help sort of fit the tone they're going for with the whole Red Worker blood magic scene. There's advice on how to bring in players that don't necessarily want to be Red Workers, but still want to be in a coterie or involved in a chronicle that's based on the scene, and sort of the different roles they can play and how they can interact with things. There's also just all sorts of different story elements and sort of examples they have that you can build a whole chronicle around or just sort of toss into an already existing one. There's also a sample chronicle called the 12 Gates. This goes for this sort of spy thriller sort of feel, and it involves the coterie trying to master the 12 crafts, the different steps. Each of them also is linked to a zodiac sign, which is kind of a fun, cool thing. And the ultimate goal of going through this process is, of course, to create a Philosopher's Stone. And the last chapter is on Loresheets. There's only 4 of them, so I guess I could just quickly tell you what those 4 are roughly. There's one for Banu Hakim that connects them to the most powerful Banu Hakim sorcerer, the one who kind of led the split in the recent edition. There's one for Thin Bloods that connects you to this legendary Thin Blood pioneer who's now deceased. There's one called Veins of the Earth, which connects you to gives you stuff that deals with the magical veins in the earth.
fulcrums and whatnot, and how to tap into those and utilize those. And one I think was at least sparked my interest at first was it's called Vienna Zero, which is the SI operation that's in charge of essentially digging through Vienna, where the Tremere had their main chantry and focus of power that got blown to hell. And now there's this SI operations dealt with picking through the remains and seeing what they can find. And this involves sort of infiltrating or being involved in that, which I think is very cool. I've said it's very cool after like half of this stuff. I don't know. It is what it is. Whatever. It's cool. If it's cool, it's cool. In closing, I'll repeat myself. I like this. I think this is a really interesting way to reimagine blood magic in a way that feels appropriate to a vampire setting. Again, my personal opinions, which just, it's me, it's not affecting you. Chill out. But also, if you're smart, you're going to agree with me, or if you have good taste, but that's whatever. Before, it just felt like is mages in a vampire game. The whole red working scene feels like vampires messing around with stuff they shouldn't. And I like that. That seems, again, more, it feels like vampire. Doesn't feel like a magic system or magic lore that could just be in all sorts of different properties, even outside of World of Darkness, like it used to be. Feels unique. Feels, again, it's dramatic. It's over the top. That's vampire, baby. If you absolutely love the Tremere from before, and you really like that they're just these traditional hermetics and the pyramid and this and that, and you are hoping this book is going to fix that and give you a lot of these just wildly out of place powers that they had access to before, it doesn't. If you don't like Tremere in 5th edition, you're still not going to like Tremere in 5th edition, so it's okay. And also, if you like it that much, you should be playing an edgy game of Mage, which is not a bad thing. That sounds fun, but it's better. I am on record, and if I'm not, I'm putting myself on record now. I'm saying Mage is my favorite, not only World of Darkness game, but it's my favorite TTRPG. And I don't have to defend that, and I won't, and I can't. But I thought of Magic before in the older editions of Vampire didn't really fit the mythos very well. Even in this one, I was about it. But again, this fixes my problem with how Magic and Vampire the Masquerade felt, which was, again, they just sort of went with, of course, there was all the different branches, and the Banakum and Zamitzi had their own little things and whatnot, but like Tremere were the main ones you thought of Magic, and they, even in their lore, they literally were mages first, and then they became vampires. And it always felt like that. These were just sort of mage interlopers in your vampire game, which could be interesting for sure. But when all the other clans most of the other clans do a much better job of like fitting into different aspects of the vampire mythos, and then you had, and some wizards snuck in, I wasn't having it. But now, again, I like the underground element, the parallels to like just this drugs and things like that. Again, it all feels more vampire. And it's not supposed to feel good. Sorry, wizards. I love. Honestly, probably my favorite thing that this did, besides some of the lore changes, was the consequences for Magic. It's so interesting to me that if I fail my roll, not just like, I got a bestial failure or a messy critical. If I just straight didn't get enough successes, this bad thing will now happen in the ritual. And a lot of times it's pretty interesting to where it's kind of the opposite of what you're trying to do. So there's risk involved in like, do I want to do this ritual? What if it goes wrong? And there's more reasons to invest in getting good at your magic and utilizing some of these like places of power and things that will help improve your rituals, or especially if you have other red workers to help you out. Like, it raises the stakes and makes everything feel more dangerous. And some of them require, again, cause aggravated wounds as part of just casting it, which means if you do that and you failed, you want to do it again, you're taking another wound. And it makes you think about, is it worth it? What's the risk reward here? And that's to me the most interesting thing about Magic in general. Again, why I love Mage. Paradox and all that stuff, it's awesome. They bring that back a little bit in this. What I really want and what I really wish they would have done was just do a quick, like, here's some consequences for, because there's already a lot of rituals already in the core book and some of the other books. I would have loved for them to kind of go back and tack on some of these potential consequences for them. Also, I am not a lore purist. I consume all of it because, of course, I do, but I use it as needed. I'm real loose with lore in my games, and never understood people who are so creatively stunted that they just can't make up something interesting for their own story, or even ignore something they don't like that they read in the book. But that's here or there. What I'm saying is, for a book with a lot of lore, so far this book, more than any of the other ones in this edition, I definitely feel the most inspired by, and I think I will be pulling the most directly from it and putting it straight in some of my Chronicles. From a mechanical standpoint, as I talked about, really like that there's consequences. I love the Wheel of Misfortune. I love that Kindred can now take Thin Blood Alchemy. It puts the Thin Bloods in a much more interesting position, and I love that it's such a big risk to doing it too, for consuming it for Kindred. Love all of that. The create your own rituals and formula, love the idea of it. I'm glad it's here, but again, I feel bad for some of the storytellers who are going to have to deal with some of the players who are really going to be annoying about it. Also, like I said before, an annoying players. They're always going to find a way to be like that. But I think it's a really cool way to sort of have that creative collaboration and come up with some really cool rituals or formulas that are like unique to your player, and your player is going to love using those, and it presents a lot of really cool opportunity. And about Thin Bloods, I was someone who wasn't, it took me a little bit to warm up to them, not because of the concept of them, but more so it felt like their formula in the core book was kind of limited. And now with all the stuff that's come out since then, and then especially with this book, Thin Bloods are wild, and I think that's awesome. I love that they're now more relevant and useful in true vampire society now, rather than just being like a sign of something bad, or just like, oh, this is the change that's happening. Also, like, no, they're coming up with wild formulas and really useful concoctions, or stuff that, if introduced in a city, can just completely dismantle stuff, like breaking blood bonds and stuff like that. It's makes them a lot more interesting lore-wise, and also they just have so many options now where you're really probably not going to feel like a dramatically underpowered Kindred anymore. Actually, some of these are probably, I could definitely see being abused. Mention the flashlight stuff. But again, it's like anything else, just figure out what works for your game. I also like that they straight up just kind of had little examples of, like, here's some of the other clans, and here's how they might get into magic and what kind of magic they might get into. It's a good chunk of them represented. Not the Venture, though. And I think that's funny. That's cool. And that was something I was already kind of doing. I like the idea that anyone could, I mean, it's like any other discipline. Anyone can learn it by, feeding, and we all know the rules. And if you don't watch my videos, what I'm saying is I'm glad that they officially acknowledged that other clans can learn magic too. One thing I thought was interesting is there's a lot of NPCs in here, like archetypes and things like that, not necessarily named ones. So there are some of that too. And I guess I don't use them a lot myself with needing the stat blocks and stuff like that. But if you're someone who likes that and who wants that to sort of populate your NPCs, your stories. There's a lot of them in here. I think it's more useful personally for more inspiration on what types of characters I have rather than needing all these stats. But I was a little surprised in just how much space they used on these stat blocks. But again, it's something that I guess was lacking in a lot of the other books. So this is a direction they're heading with some of the newer ones. I'm fine with it. Overall, like I said, this isn't really a review. I don't think it's super useful to score like a TTRPG book. I think a book has an intention of what they're trying to do, and it's good or bad whether it succeeds in that whatever they intended to do. Some games and some books are going to be awesome for some people. Other people's will hate it. It's like everything else. But all of that together, personally, hopefully have a bit of an idea of my style and whatnot. And like I said, like it a lot. It's weird. It's cool. Some interesting mechanics, some interesting lore. And you know how I know this was good is because a warning I'm going to give to anyone who wants to get this book is this is going to make you want to do a whole chronicle based on blood magic. So please read with caution, especially if you're someone who already has a few chronicles well underway and you start thinking, what if I blew those up and we started this instead? But if you're willing to take that risk and if you're a stronger person than me, I recommend checking it out for sure. Like I said, this is one of my favorite books that's been out for this edition in a minute. So this chapter's closed. Our ritual must end. Thank you for letting me in, and don't forget to close the door. What if, instead of blowing out a candle, I blew you a little kiss? It's very late at night.